Fantasy worlds are filled with impossible places. Enchanted cities lit by glowing crystals and traversed by flying ships, wizard towers inhabited by archmages where the laws of reality are bent, ancient ruins with runes of power on every wall. But for all the magical places built by people, the natural world can end up feeling somewhat mundane. There will of course be magical places, you'll find the occasional fairy grove or magic wellspring hidden away, but these are limited, like a single building in an otherwise normal city. Places that are more generally fantastical are usually that way because of what's found in them. A forest will be considered magical for being the home of magical creatures, but there's little different about the woods themselves. The geography and to a lesser extent ecology in fantasy worlds is often pretty mundane. Forests are still just collections of trees. Deserts are stretches of sand. Oceans are mostly empty water. But fantasy has a lot more potential than that. In a world thoroughly changed by magic, where dragons roam and dwarves and elves walk the land, that land can be changed and shaped by new forces. From enhancing existing biomes, to merging disparate places together, to even introducing wholly new landscapes, there's a lot of potential to be explored. One of the most immediately obvious options is to take what is already there and change how much of it there is. In a genre that already enjoys stories of a grand scale, bigger is often the preferred direction to go in. Mountain ranges that pierce impossibly far into the heavens and oceans too vast to cross are a staple. This sort of upscaling allows the terrain to contain a lot more. If an author wants to write about mountain civilizations but also has ideas for how they would interact with various other biomes, they can simply all be encompassed by the mountains. Plateaus at various heights can hold grassy plains or frozen pine woods. An ancient caldera on a huge mountain could fill to hold an entire sea. When dealing with this sort of worldbuilding, there's no real requirement for realism. You've moved so far out of the realm of what's possible that it makes suspension of disbelief easier, and the only thing that matters is internal consistency. Scaling up the size or duration of more local effects can also create new biomes. While storms can grow very large, a planet-wide storm is another matter entirely, especially if it lasts a long time. Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight archive features a world heavily affected by vast regular storms. These have shaped the geography and the life of the planet into something very fantastical. Though having a storm only be massive may just flood an area, the high storms of Rocha are also extremely powerful. Increasing the duration instead turns the storm into a sort of terrain of its own. A regular or even small storm that remains in one spot acts like a geographical feature for the purposes of worldbuilding. Storms are not the only thing that can be changed this way. Other natural disasters like earthquakes or volcano eruptions, or safer things like fog, temperature changes or heat haze are also an option. A huge region of permanent mist is a gentle alternative to a permanent storm that still significantly changes the surroundings. Temperature changes all the time, but a solid wall of heat or cold rolling across the landscape separately from the normal weather is a lot more notable. If a temperature change is extreme enough, it could lead to evolution of wildlife that adapts to changing conditions, the way coastal animals account for the tides. A visual effect like heat haze or a rainbow would immediately make a landscape far more magical with their presence. While there are many changes an author can make to the landscape to shake things up, few are quite as versatile or as iconic as simply making things fly. Airborne mountains, flying nations, islands and clusters, or entire continents. There's a lot of ways to make it happen. As a general rule, the size of a landmass will be tied to how high up it is. Small islands or chunks of rock will float just off the ground. Maybe a shattered cliff face whose shards float instead of falling. Or rock formations like mesas or karst mountains, with a few of them floating between the others. Higher up, the islands get larger. A chunk big enough to hold a number of buildings will probably fly well overhead. City-sized islands are way up in the sky, and country-sized islands almost exclusively sit above the clouds. This is essentially a practical concession. Too large of a flying island can completely block the sky from anything below, unless it's way up in the air. Any land under a country-sized flying island would for all intents and purposes be underground. The big question to ask is whether these islands move. Should they stay in the same place, they can be traversed much like regular terrain. Sure, you might need a ladder to get up, but once you're there, it's another bit of land. A bridge from a cliff to its flying neighbour functions the same as a bridge between two regular cliffs. If they move, however, it's very different. An area with rapidly flying boulders is a serious hazard. If a string of mountains float along a set path, an author could design a civilization that is both sedentary and nomadic, as their permanent cities drift through the world. Of course, all the options discussed so far are still made of rock. Besides the obvious alternative of having seas to go along with the land, there's also the possibility of making islands out of other materials. Solid clouds are seen in a number of fairy tales. These make the floating island environment that much more fantastical. They can act as simple ground the same way earth and stone do, or as a material with completely different rules and properties. Whether the clouds are still wet with condensation, soft and springy, or completely solid. Other options include picking materials that thematically fit the sky, such as coalesced light, or no land at all. Rather than a solid landmass in the sky, an author can treat the air like water, inhabited by all manner of flying creatures. A cluster of airborne plants traversed by animals akin to a coral reef makes for a great location to have characters visit by airship. On the topic of coral reefs, similar ideas apply to underwater and underground environments as airborne environments. Take a surface location and flood it or put it in a cave. Of course, that's just the absolute basics. There are a few tropes to consider for both locations, like mushroom caves or coral cities. Beyond that, however, inhabited underground and underwater locations are so different from the surface that they are pretty fantastical by default. As such, a certain amount of world building has to be done to include them in the first place. Going into greater detail on that front would require a video in its own right and won't be covered here. Fantasy terrain doesn't necessarily need to be inherently magical or supernatural. Obviously, flying islands and mountains piercing outer space are fictional, they couldn't exist on Earth, but they could fit into a fictional world's laws of physics. From a storytelling and world-building perspective, magic is something different than the real-life definition. Fictional magic is a specific power rather than anything that would be supernatural in the real world. Lands that are explicitly magical open up interesting opportunities of their own. Powerful magic can scar the landscape. In the aftermath of a great battle or ritual, all manner of arcane effect can be left behind. Elemental affinities, warped space, or arcane taint poisoning the land. Depending on how long ago the incident was and how well history has been preserved, the inhabitants of the world may not know that the effect is in any way artificial. On the opposite side, a land could be blessed by some effect. It may cause people in the area to heal more easily or never age. These may not seem like geography at first glance, and to a certain extent that is correct. The difference, I believe, comes in how pervasive and varied the effect is. A land blessed with a healing effect is simply enchanted. Some divine realm with literal rivers of milk and honey, where every nook and cranny is lit up by light without a source, and the animals have no need to eat, eventually stops resembling any regular biome. It's the flip side of my opening point about magical forests often being mundane forests with a few magical creatures in them. If there are enough actually magical things about the woods, they become something else. Altered landscapes that function under different rules or present new interactions with the land do a great deal to set a place apart. As far as ways to alter the landscape go, another option seen in multiple stories is the corpse of a dead god. The Neath, from the games Fallen London and Sunless Sea, is a vast cavern underground that holds an entire sea and multiple nations. In the darkness, many of the rules of nature are loosened. One of the theories the game presents is that the entire place is a dream in the skull of a dead god. The Marvel Cinematic Universe's Guardians of the Galaxy features Nowhere, the colossal head of a dead celestial. The skull is inhabited and mined for its tissues. These are two fairly different approaches to the same idea, which just highlights its versatility. An author can adjust the details to better suit the world. Even if the changes are clearly caused by some higher power, adjusting how direct and known that power is will shift the tone and feel in the same way as designing a magic system. This may be more important with effects that seem more magical on the surface than the others. Even floating islands will show up in very soft sci-fi like the Avatar movies, but a mana-tainted place where spells go haywire is explicitly fantasy. An author will need to keep in mind any rules they may have set for their magic system, and how such an area would interact with them. If a place can be blighted accidentally, it can be done deliberately and someone is going to try. With all the things that can be put in, on, under and around a world, it's easy to, as the saying goes, not see the forest for the trees. The most far-reaching change to make to a world is not its many features, but the shape of the world itself. The Earth is a globe, and it's generally assumed that fantasy worlds are the same, but that doesn't need to be the case. Terry Pratchett's Discworld takes place on a flat world with a clear edge. It's possible to fall off here, and the disc itself is balanced somewhat precariously. The edge of the world presents a number of opportunities for authors. Rather than a hard drop like Discworld, the idea that reality breaks down beyond the edge of the map is also fairly common. For those who want the core of their setting to be more grounded, or who are designing distant magical lands, putting the magical geography at the end of a world sets a natural border, separating the mundane and the supernatural, without having to rely on portals. Worlds in the shape of rings or donuts will mostly function the same as globes from the perspective of the characters living on their surface. There will of course be the big difference of seeing the rest of the world in the sky. This also applies for worlds that are hollow spheres inhabited on the inside. For those accessing the underground, things may be a bit different. Depending on how thin the ring is, there may be very little space to dig before reaching the outside. An author with one of these worlds may also consider ways to get from one place to another. With other sections of the world visible in the sky, it feels more natural to have connections between them. Altered gravity flows between sections of a ring or an ocean filling the center of a donut are ways to really integrate the earlier ideas into these new world shapes. Choosing to use a differently shaped world tends to sit at two extremes of a spectrum in terms of how much impact it has on the world building. On one end, many fantasy universes have the planes of existence be literal flat planes. The stars in the sky of these planes are often not actual stars, and the planes are flat to neatly sidestep the issue of having entire universes beyond the sky of each plane. The plane is not a planet and consists of what's immediately accessible on it and nothing else. On the other end, we get worlds where the unique shape is central to the plot. Science fantasy is fairly fond of Dyson spheres, and you can easily find a multitude of tabletop RPGs that feature lots of world building and history on how the world came to be and how its residents ended up there. The physical shape and makeup of a world is one of those things that feels like it should be very relevant to world building, but in truth can be easily ignored. Much like politics, ancient history, or economics, while we generally understand that these things heavily shape the world, if the characters in the story don't interact with them, then they're often not that relevant. Even for a pure world builder with no interest in the story, if they're focused on fleshing out the daily lives of people in a city and designing the local cuisine, they probably don't care about the surrounding geography or ecology, beyond having a list of foods that are simply farmed somewhere else. It doesn't matter where. And yet, like many specific fields of world building, if an author does choose to explore it, there is huge potential to be found here. The backdrop of a truly fantastical world can add a wonderful feeling of magic to a story in a way that sits comfortably in the background and doesn't demand more exploration or explanation than the author wants to give. And in the modern approach to world building, where world builders consider access to water and resources when placing their cities, and discuss meteorology and watersheds when placing biomes on a map, a little fantastical geography can offer new avenues for them to explore and new tools to shape a world into exactly what its creator is looking for.